Okay, well, this week's module again is broken down into two separate lectures, given the breadth of the subject matter. And so this week again we're going to continue to examine concepts of forest protection, in particular wildfire behavior and management. So the first question we need to address, one that we're going to come back to repeatedly in this module, is the question of whether forest fires are good or bad. And the short answer is that it depends, right? It depends on how you define good and bad, which is typically a function of how the fire was initiated and what the expected ecological and social impacts will be if that fire is allowed to burn. On the left-hand side of the slide is an image of a lightning-initiated fire in eastern North Carolina on the coastal plain. And though it was initiated by a natural event, you would be hard-pressed to convince the folks on the other side of that road that it would be a good thing to let it burn, just because it was a natural start. The image on the right is of a longleaf pine forest, an ecosystem that is fire dependent. Though this particular fire was initiated by humans as part of a prescribed burning treatment. And so this, though this may not be a natural fire occurrence, it was purposefully set to manage and perpetuate that forest community. Most folks would classify this as a good fire. The cause of wildfire varies throughout the U.S. Overall, arson or maliciously set fire accounts for the most fire starts. There is, however, a whole lot of regional variability regarding fire starts. The leading cause of wildfire here in western North Carolina is careless burning of debris, brush piles that are left unattended. We do have lightning-induced fire, and we do have forest communities in western North Carolina that are fire dependent, but fire as a result of lightning is a less frequent occurrence. In the western U.S., the average relative humidity is significantly less than here in the eastern U.S. There are seasonal drying wind events that occur, and there's far more lightning storms that are not accompanied by rain. Therefore, lightning-induced fire is a much more common occurrence for those reasons in that part of the country. Lightning is also a more common occurrence for fire starts in the eastern part of North Carolina as well, when compared to the western part of the state. So as you may have gathered already, this term "natural," as it applies to fire, is a funky term. It's hard to nail down. There are forest ecosystems that have evolved in the presence of fire and require fire to perpetuate the system, and there are ecosystems that have not. The term historical fire regime refers to the frequency and intensity of fire in a given ecosystem over time. And so we've already established, several modules ago that humans have been present in the southern Appalachians for over 10,000 years, long enough for there to have been changes in climate significant enough to fundamentally alter the ecosystems that are present. Add to this the fact that fire was the primary tool used by people indigenous to the southern Appalachians, and you kind of come to the conclusion that when evaluating fire as a natural component of our ecosystems here, whether for management or restoration purposes, you cannot remove the influence of people on that fire regime. The montane oak hickory forest natural community includes much of the upland forest here in the southern Appalachians. Based on historical evidence compiled by forest ecologists looking primarily at undisturbed forest land, the fire regime of this community includes fires of low to mixed severity with a return interval generally less than 35 years. This indicates that this type of disturbance may be necessary, or at least one ingredient of the management mix necessary to perpetuate this type of community. The acidic cove forest community present throughout are more sheltered landscape positions, north-facing coves, northeast-facing slopes, where things are cooler and generally soil moisture is higher. These areas historically burned far less frequently. This slide here with a big white oak in the foreground is an example of this montane oak hickory forest community, a community that historically was impacted by relatively frequent fire, historically speaking. But from a restoration perspective, fire wasn't the only reason why this community looks the way it does now. And as you should all be aware of by now, given the dynamics of forest development and succession, there's really no way to replicate the exact ecological conditions present during the development of this community. But a good first step is to understand how fire may have impacted the trajectory of this community as it's developed over time. And this slide just provides an example of an image of an acidic cove forest community, big yellow poplar in the foreground there, where fire has played a minimal role in community development. The relationship between fire and people has always been a really complex one. The people indigenous to the southern Appalachians, as well as the early European settlers that followed, utilized fire for a variety of reasons. They utilized fire to drive game and improve habitat for game species. They also utilized fire to clear land for agricultural purposes. The estimates I have seen regarding the pre-colonization population levels in America, they vary, but estimates run as high as 18 million people, and even well above that. By 1800, post-European contact, that number goes way down to 600,000 as a result of a few different things, but disease introduced by Europeans is kind of the primary reason among those reasons. But by the end of the 1800s, the population of America is again on the order of 76 million people. The point I'm trying to get across here is that results in a lot of intentionally set, uncontrolled fire on the landscape. You have a traditional practice of burning that is now being utilized by a lot more people. And again, this just results in a lot of fire on the landscape. Fire played a really prominent role in shaping the forested landscape, or at least what used to be a forested landscape at the beginning of the 20th century. If you can remember back to our history module way back in the second week of the class, the early 1900s was a time of large-scale liquidation harvesting in the eastern U.S. Basically, when the timber industry had cut all that could be had from the New England states and all that could be had from the lake states, they started to move down the southern Appalachians, into western North Carolina eventually, where land was cut over. All those tops and limbs and unmerchantable material was left in the woods. This provided fuel for some pretty catastrophic fire events, often triggered by sparks from railroad cars that were pulling the logs out of the woods. In addition to all this, landowners would set fires intentionally, right, to clear land for the reasons that I mentioned earlier, and they'd let these things smolder for weeks at a time. Combine this with a series of drought events in the early part of the 20th century. This resulted in pretty high fire risk, and eventually it led to fires that were millions of acres in size. And by 1908, a government survey of the southern Appalachians indicated that approximately 86% of the total forested acreage in the region was either cleared or in some early stage of secondary growth, and nearly all of that acreage had been burned. And those are pretty staggering numbers. Because of the growing concern for wildfire, in light of the high environmental and social toll, the U.S. Forest Service initiated a policy of complete fire exclusion by the 1930s on public land. Under the Clark-McNary Act of 1924, the federal government began to provide support to state agencies as well, who were tasked with managing wildfire on private forest land. In 1935, the U.S. Forest Service initiated what was referred to as the 10 a.m. policy, mandating that all fires detected would be extinguished by 10 a.m. the following morning. In some western states where there was often a large number of fires at any given time, and fires of really large size were common, this 10 a.m. policy was really impossible to carry out. And so at this point, the U.S. Forest Service began to set up a resource priority system. Fires that would result in the loss of life or property were handled first, and suppression tactics were put in place first on those. And those fires that occurred in areas of wilderness where there wasn't an imminent threat to life and property, that these were treated as secondary priorities. And at this point, enter Smokey Bear, one of the most successful marketing characters ever developed. Everybody knows who Smokey is, and everybody knows his message. Only you can prevent forest fires. If you notice, the poster on the left indicates that you may only be able to prevent 9 out of 10 fires. Smokey delivered a very specific message to the American public. In the broadest sense, all fires are bad and destructive, and we should be vigilant to reduce their occurrence. Ecological thought has progressed to the point where we as a society are asking harder questions of ourselves. Primarily, should we be suppressing all forest fire? If not, which ones do we allow to burn? Which fires do we intentionally set, and how do we do that? And so things have become a little more complicated since the emergence of Smokey and his message. And so just to sort of wrap up this portion of the lecture, in terms of the ecological role of fire and the social implications of fire on the landscape, we can kind of look at fire in, further along in the 20th century, and fire up till now, how fire is managed up till now. We're now at a point where forest ecologists and resource managers have a greater understanding regarding fire on the landscape and the ways in which fire alters the vegetative composition and structure of different forest communities. This recognition came by the 1960s and ushered in a new fire management strategy for the U.S. Forest Service. As part of U.S. Forest Service planning on national forest land, areas where fire plays a key ecological role are identified and designated. Within these areas, prescribed fire, intentionally set fire under predetermined weather conditions, is utilized to restore areas where fire has been previously suppressed. Where a wildfire occurs through any means in one of these designated areas, it is typically allowed to burn and is managed accordingly. Where wildfire threatens life or property, which is becoming a very common occurrence throughout most parts of the United States, aggressive suppression efforts are initiated. Though fire is now recognized and utilized as a restoration tool, the historic extent and frequency of fire on the landscape throughout the different regions of the country is still widely debated and researched. The concept of forest restoration is always tricky, especially as it relates to fire management, because you always have to choose a baseline condition. You have to decide what you are restoring and why, what period in time you're going to try to move back to, and often we can't put all those pieces back in a row together to get back to that exact point in time. And for a lot of management purposes, it's not necessary to do that. The goal is to just understand what conditions were in place that moved these ecosystems to the condition where that we find them in today, and recognize how we'd like these ecosystems to look in the future, and utilize this knowledge base and utilize these management tools accordingly. Fire being one of them. For the second part of this module, we're just going to cover a few concepts of fire behavior, and also a few concepts regarding wildfire control, control strategy and control tactics. The most basic concept, what we typically start with first when discussing fire behavior, is the concept of the fire triangle. There are 3 fundamental things necessary for a fire to occur, for combustion to occur. And the way we extinguish fire, in a really broad sense, is by removing one of the sides of this triangle. The heat refers to the source of ignition. That could be a lightning strike or an intentionally set pile of brush that's left unattended and allowed to spread. Anything that the ignition source. The fuel refers to anything that will burn. In the context of wildfire, this typically includes dead woody material, grasses, shrubs, and in some cases the live crowns of trees. The final side of the triangle, oxygen, it's a required component for combustion. Without the presence of oxygen, fire cannot occur. To reiterate, we suppress fire by removing one side of that fire triangle. So fuel may be removed by establishing a fire line in advance of the flaming front. On gentle terrain, fire line is most often constructed by bulldozers that may either push a line down to mineral soil with the blade of a bulldozer or drag a line down to mineral soil with a rear-mounted fire plow. On rougher terrain, as is the case with much of the southern Appalachians and western United States, fire line is typically constructed by hand crews utilizing hand tools. Oxygen and heat may be removed by applying dirt, water, or fire-retardant chemicals to the fire. In a wildland setting, water and retardant, they are most often transported and applied by aircraft. Dirt is often utilized by hand crews during the mop-up process, which we'll get into towards the end of this lecture. In the world of wildland firefighting, there are what are known as 10 standard firefighting orders and 18 situations referred to as watch-out situations. It is expected that all fireline personnel adhere to the 10 and remain cognizant of the 18 as a means of fighting fire aggressively but safely. And so for our purposes here, we're not going to go into all of them, but what we are going to do is look closely at what's referred to as LCES. So LCES is an acronym utilized by fire personnel to ensure that they are operating safely at all times on the fire line. It is important that a lookout is in place at all times, monitoring fire behavior and relaying that information to personnel that may not have eyes on the whole thing, or if any of it at all. So often this is accomplished through communication with air resources, scout planes, helicopters. All crews maintain communication typically through portable radios. Communication is essential among all personnel involved in suppression efforts, and a chain of command is established to relay essential information in a systematic and timely manner. During line construction and suppression efforts, it's necessary to have a predetermined escape route in the event of a change in fire behavior that results in the crew needing to get to a safety zone. A safety zone is defined as a place where a crew can remain safe. This is a cleared area, kind of a fuel-free zone. It's an area where a crew can remain safe during the passage of the fire without having to deploy fire shelters. And we'll talk about fire shelters here on the next slide.